March 6, 1944. A lone P-51 Mustang tears across the German sky at 400 miles per hour. 14 Luftwaffe fighters are closing in from every direction. The pilot? He's just 22 years old. He's been flying combat missions for only 9 days. In the next 3 minutes, he's about to do something nobody thought was possible. The air war over Europe in early 1944 was basically a deadly numbers game. American bombers would fly into Germany in massive formations, sometimes 500 planes at once. Each B-17 Flying Fortress carried 10 crew members. The losses were absolutely brutal. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers at a rate that made commanders sick to their stomachs. On some missions, 1 out of every 4 bombers didn't make it back. Do the math at that rate. A bomber crew's chances of surviving their required 25 missions were basically 0. The big problem? Range. The P-47 Thunderbolts could escort the bombers partway into Germany. But then they'd hit their fuel limit and have to turn back. The bombers would continue on alone. That's when the German Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters would pounce. They knew exactly where the American escorts had to leave. They'd just wait there like wolves. Engineers tried everything to solve this problem. Extra fuel tanks, stripping out guns to save weight. Nothing worked. The bombers desperately needed a fighter that could fly all the way to Berlin and back. That aircraft simply didn't exist. Then North American Aviation rolled out the P-51 Mustang. It came equipped with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and this incredibly efficient laminar flow wing design. On paper, it could reach Berlin and return. But in reality, early pilots had some very different names for it: Widowmaker, Deathtrap, Flying Coffin. The complaints were specific. The canopy design had blind spots that made it hard to see threats from certain angles. In a dogfight, that'll get you killed. The fuel system was temperamental. Sometimes the engine would just quit at high altitude. The landing gear was fragile and would collapse on rough runways. More than one pilot survived combat only to crash on landing. But here's the thing: the range was undeniable. So the Mustangs went into service anyway. Fighter units started converting from P-47s to P-51s through the winter of 1943. The pilots weren't happy. They missed the Thunderbolt's toughness, that big radial engine that could take a beating. The Mustang felt fragile in comparison, light, fast, and unforgiving. One of these skeptical pilots was a farm kid from Iowa named Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson. He arrived in England in February 1944 with 200 hours of flight time in his logbook. 0 of those hours involved anybody shooting at him. His squadron commander assigned him to fly wing for a veteran pilot. The orders were simple: stay close, watch, learn. Don't try anything creative. The weather in East Anglia that late winter was typical low clouds, constant drizzle, fog rolling across the airfields. Mechanics worked in the freezing cold while Johnson spent his first week flying practice missions. Formation flying, gunnery practice, emergency procedures. The Mustang handled completely differently than the training planes he'd flown back home. It was lighter on the controls, more responsive. It wanted to go fast. On March 5th, his squadron got orders for a maximum range escort mission, a ball-bearing plant deep inside Germany. The bombers would be flying for hours. The fighters would fly farther than any American fighters had flown in this war. Johnson's element leader briefed him the night before. Stick close. Save your fuel. If something happens, if I go down, head straight home. Don't try to be a hero. New guys who try to be heroes die in their first week. Johnson understood. The mission launched before dawn. Engines coughed to life in the darkness. One by one, the Mustangs taxied to the runway. Johnson's hand rested on the throttle, feeling the engine vibrate through the entire airframe. They climbed through the clouds and broke into sunlight at 15,000 feet. The bombers were already there, stacked in huge formations that stretched for miles. The formations turned east. Germany waited beyond the horizon. For 2 hours, everything went smoothly, and the radios crackled bandits spotted high and to the north. The bomber gunners opened fire first. Tracer rounds streaked across the sky. Luftwaffe fighters dove through the formations, firing and then climbing away before the escorts could react. Johnson's element turned hard. He followed his leader, eyes scanning everywhere, trying to track everything at once. A Focke-Wulf flashed past so close he could see the pilot's head turn. Then it was gone. The fight spread across 20 miles of sky. Johnson lost his leader in a cloud bank. He called over the radio, no response. He climbed, scanned, checked his fuel, then turned west. The protocol was clear. If you get separated, go home. He was 10 minutes into his flight home when he saw them. 14 German fighters circling a crippled B-17. The bomber was trailing smoke from 2 engines, fallen behind the formation, limping westward alone. The German fighters were taking turns. Attacking it, one would dive, fire, pull up, then the next one would go. They were methodical. They knew the bomber couldn't escape. Johnson's fuel gauge read half full. Every bit of his training said go home. The math said one P-51 couldn't fight 14 enemy fighters and survive. He pushed the throttle forward and dove straight at them. Robert Johnson grew up in a place where knowing how to fix things mattered more than anything else. Central Iowa flat farmland, cornfields stretching to every horizon. The Johnson family ran a modest farm. Hogs, grain, some dairy cows. Robert was the middle child, quiet, observant, good with his hands. He discovered engines early. His father had this 1932 Ford tractor that broke down constantly. Most farmers would have junked it, but they couldn't afford a replacement. So 12-year-old Robert learned to fix it. He'd read repair manuals by lamplight, take parts apart on the kitchen table, clean them, figure out how they worked, and put them back together. The tractor ran, kept running. His dad stopped calling the mechanic. By 16, Robert was fixing neighbors' equipment for cash. He developed a reputation fast, reliable, cheap. He saved every dollar he made in a coffee can under his bed. He had a plan. There was a grass airstrip about 20 miles south where a barnstormer ran joy rides 15-minute flights for $1. Robert rode his bicycle there one Saturday in the summer of 1938, paid his $1, and climbed into the front seat of an old Travel Air biplane. The engine roared to life. They rolled across the grass, lifted off. He felt the exact moment the wheels left the ground. The world dropped away below him. Fields became patchwork squares. Roads became thin lines. He could see 3 counties from 2,000 feet. The wind roared, the wires sang, the engine hammered. It was the loudest, most beautiful thing he'd ever experienced. He wanted to do it again. He came back every Saturday for a year, spending all his repair money on flight time. The barnstormer was a Great War veteran who'd flown over France and been shot down twice. He saw something in this quiet farm kid and offered him a deal. Work the airstrip, fuel the planes, help with repairs. In exchange, free flight lessons. Johnson jumped at it. He soloed after 8 hours and earned his private pilot's license at 17. By 18, he had 100 hours and a commercial license. He took a job flying cargo mail runs, auto parts, occasionally a passenger. Small planes, short hops. He learned weather flying by necessity, learned navigation by dead reckoning. Then came December 7th, 1941. He heard about Pearl Harbor on a radio in a hangar in Omaha. War. He enlisted the next morning. The recruiter asked if he had flight experience. Johnson showed his logbook. The recruiter smiled. Johnson was in the Army Air Forces by noon. He shipped to England in February 1944 and joined the 357th Fighter Group flying P-51 Mustangs. The group had only been operational a few weeks. Everyone was still learning the aircraft, the tactics, the enemy. The veterans who briefed the new pilots spoke plainly. Fighter combat over Germany wasn't like the training films. It wasn't graceful. Dogfights turned into chaos in seconds. You wouldn't see the fighter that killed you. If you survived your first 5 missions, your odds improved. Most pilots didn't survive the first 5. Johnson listened, took notes, asked questions. The answers were practical. Check behind you constantly. Never fly straight and level for more than 10 seconds. If your engines hit dive for cloud cover, if you're on fire, bail out. If you're too low to bail out, find a field. He flew his first combat mission on February 28th. Nothing happened. 8 hours in the cockpit, no enemy contact. But his hands were shaking when he climbed out pure adrenaline. He'd been tense for 7 straight hours. The next 3 missions were similar long, cold, tense, uneventful. On March 5th, everything changed. The problem facing the 8th Air Force in early 1944 came down to a series of failures that, when combined, created a crisis threatening the entire bombing campaign. First failure. American doctrine assumed bomber formations could defend themselves. The theory was elegant. A combat box of 18 B-17s carried 180 50-caliber machine guns, creating overlapping fields of fire. Any attacking fighter would have to fly through a wall of bullets. The math said it should work. The Luftwaffe proved the math wrong. German fighters attacked head-on from above at combined closing speeds over 600 miles per hour. The bombers' forward guns couldn't track fast enough. The German fighters would flash through, guns blazing, then dive away before the gunners could react. Second failure. Early escort fighters didn't have the range. The P-47 Thunderbolt was an excellent aircraft tough, heavily armed, fast in a dive, but its engine gulped fuel. Even with drop tanks, it could only escort bombers as far as the German border. Beyond that, the bombers were on their own. The Luftwaffe knew exactly where the escorts had to turn back. They called it the death zone. They waited there every single day. Third failure. They couldn't replace crews fast enough. In October 1943 alone, the 8th Air Force lost over 200 bombers. Each one carried 10 trained men. Replacing them required months of training back in the States. The pipeline was long. The losses were fast. By December 1943, planners ran the numbers. At the current loss rate, the 8th Air Force would cease to exist as an effective fighting force within 6 months. Either the losses had to decrease, or the invasion of Europe would happen without air support. Engineers tried modifications to the P-47: more fuel, less weight. The tests showed minimal improvement. The Thunderbolt's design had reached its limits. Some pushed for the twin-engine P-38 Lightning, which had good range, but the P-38 had serious problems in the cold. Its systems would freeze at high altitude. Pilots came back with frostbite. Some lost fingers. That left the P-51 Mustang. North American Aviation had designed it in 1940 for the British. The original version used an American Allison engine, good at low altitude, mediocre above 15,000 feet. Then somebody had an idea. What if they swapped in a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine? They tested it in late 1942. The results were extraordinary. The Merlin-powered Mustang could cruise at 400 miles per hour and reach 42,000 feet. Its special wing design provided exceptional efficiency. With internal fuel and 2 drop tanks, it could fly to Berlin and back. No other Allied fighter could do that. The Army Air Forces ordered them in bulk. But the Mustang arrived with problems. The fuel system was complicated. 6 internal tanks that had to be managed precisely. Switch tanks at the wrong moment, and the engine could quit. The canopy design created blind spots. Pilots complained they couldn't see threats from above and behind. In combat, that was deadly. The landing gear was narrow and sometimes collapsed on landing. Early reports were mixed. The 354th Fighter Group flew the first combat missions in December 1943. They loved the range and speed. They scored kills, but they also took losses. Some pilots even asked to transfer back to P-47s. The requests were denied. The numbers were clear. The Mustang was the only plane that could escort bombers to the deepest targets. Pilots would have to adapt. By March 1944, 3 fighter groups had converted to P-51s. The 357th was the newest, barely operational. Robert Johnson's squadron had flown exactly 6 combat missions. On the 7th, he found himself alone. His element leader had vanished into clouds during the fight. Johnson climbed, searched, called on the radio. Nothing. Protocol said go home. Separated pilots were dead pilots. But then he saw that crippled bomber, a B-17 trailing smoke. 2 engines dead, falling behind, surrounded by 14 Luftwaffe fighters, taking turns attacking it. The bomber's gunners were firing, but there were too many attackers from too many angles. The B-17 was dying slowly. Johnson checked his fuel. Half tanks enough to get home, not enough for a long fight. He looked at the bomber. 10 men aboard, probably some wounded, definitely terrified, watching enemy fighters line up to kill them, knowing nobody was coming to help. He thought about the math. 1 P-51 versus 14 German fighters. The odds were suicide. He thought about the men in that bomber. Then he stopped thinking and dove. Johnson's dive took him from 28,000 feet to 15,000 in 40 seconds. The Mustang screamed past 400 knots. The airframe shuddered. Wind howled over the canopy. He pulled back hard on the stick. The gee forces crushed him into his seat. His vision narrowed. He leveled out 200 yards behind the nearest Focke-Wulf. The German pilot didn't see him. Johnson centered the gun sight, the Focke-Wulf filling the reticle. He pressed the trigger. 650 caliber guns opened fire. The Mustang shook. Spent shell casings flew everywhere. Tracers converged. The Focke-Wulf's tail disintegrated. The fighter snapped left, spun, fell. Now the Germans saw him. 2 Messerschmitt 109s broke toward him. Johnson yanked hard right. The Mustang responded instantly. He climbed, rolled, reversed. The 109s followed. They were good, experienced. They worked as a team, one high, one low, trying to box him in, force a mistake. Johnson pushed the throttle forward. The Mustang's speed advantage opened the gap. The 109s chased. He let them, drawing them away from the bomber. 1,000 yards. 2,000. Then he reversed hard. The 109s overshot. For 3 seconds, Johnson had a clean shot. He took it, hitting the lower 109 in the wing root. Fuel ignited. The fighter trailed flame. The pilot bailed out, his parachute blossoming white. The second 109 broke off and dove away. Johnson checked behind him clear. He looked for the bomber. Still there, still flying, still surrounded. The remaining Luftwaffe fighters had regrouped. 12 now. They'd stopped their methodical attacks. They'd seen what happened to their comrades. They were angry. 4 of them turned toward Johnson. He should run. Every instinct, every hour of training, every briefing said, go, get out. You're outnumbered. You're low on fuel. You're alone. He turned straight into them. The 4 German fighters spread out into classic attack formation. They'd hit him from multiple angles, force him to choose. Whichever one he engaged, the others would kill him. The tactic had worked 1,000 times before. Johnson didn't engage any of them. He flew straight at them, full throttle, head on. A game of chicken at 600 miles per hour, combined closing speed. The Germans opened fire first. Cannon shells streamed past, tracers lighting up the sky. Johnson waited. The range closed 500 yards, 300, 200. At 100 yards, he fired. Then he rolled inverted and dove under them. The 4 German fighters scattered. 1 trailed smoke. Johnson didn't see if it crashed. He was already pulling up, already scanning for the next threat. The bomber was dotting. Its pilot had seen an opportunity. While the fighters were distracted, he dropped into cloud cover. Smart. Johnson followed him down. The remaining German fighters followed too. They entered the clouds together. Visibility dropped to zero, just gray nothing. Johnson flew on instruments, altimeter, airspeed, heading. He knew the bomber was close. He knew the Germans were close. But he couldn't see anything. He broke out underneath at 6,000 feet. The bomber was there, 300 yards ahead, limping westward. The German fighters broke out seconds later. They didn't panic. They didn't scatter. They formed up like professionals and prepared for another coordinated attack. Johnson counted 8 now. 2 were damaged, trailing smoke or coolant. The others looked fresh, ready, deadly. They had ammunition. They had fuel. They had numbers. Johnson had rage. He climbed into them again. This time they didn't scatter. This time they turned straight into him. A head-on merge, 4 Mustang guns versus 16 German guns. The combined fire was apocalyptic. The sky filled with tracers. Johnson's windscreen cracked. Something punched through his left wing. Metal rang like a bell. He kept firing. A Messerschmitt exploded, just detonated mid-air in a bright flash. Debris tumbled. The fireball dropped away. Johnson pulled up hard. The G-forces grayed his vision. He gasped, breathed, cleared his head. He rolled and checked behind him. A Focke-Wulf was there, guns flashing. Johnson broke left. Too late. Rounds hammered his fuselage behind the cockpit. Something vital shredded. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across his canopy. The controls felt sluggish. He checked the gauge's hydraulic pressure dropping. Not gone, but fading. The landing gear ran on hydraulics. The flaps ran on hydraulics. If the system failed completely, landing would be fast, dangerous, possibly fatal. He ignored it and kept fighting. The German fighters were reforming. 5 left. No, 6-1 climbed from below. He'd lost count. They weren't running. They weren't retreating. They wanted him specifically. He'd killed their comrades, humiliated them. 1 American, alone, still alive. They attacked together. Johnson met them alone. What happened next wasn't graceful. It wasn't tactical. It was desperation, turned into violence. He shot 1 fighter at 50 yards, the round sawing through the cockpit. The fighter spun down. He pulled so hard, the Mustang shuddered on the edge of a stall. Kicked rudder, skidded, fired again. Missed. A 109 flashed past, so close he saw the pilot's face. Young, scared, then gone. Johnson's ammunition counters wound down. He had maybe 10 seconds of firing time left, maybe less. He needed to make it count. He lined up a Focke-Wulf, centered it, waited for the perfect shot. The German broke. Johnson followed, fired it. The Wolf's engine seized, propeller stopped. The fighter glided down, out of the fight. Johnson's guns clicked empty. No more ammunition. He toggled the switches. Nothing. The guns were dry. The remaining German fighters didn't know this. Johnson turned into them anyway, angled his nose, lined up as if preparing to fire. The Germans broke defensive. They'd seen what his guns could do. They didn't want to test them again. Johnson used the bluff to extend, opened the throttle. The Mustang accelerated. The Germans gave chase, but half-heartedly. They were low on fuel, too, low on ammunition. They'd lost too many already. 1 American wasn't worth dying for. They broke off. Johnson watched them go. His hands shook. His heart hammered. He looked down. The bomber was still there, still flying, heading west. He formed up on its wing. The bomber's waist gunner waved. Johnson waved back. They flew together for 20 minutes. Then the bomber's crew signaled. They could see the English coast. They were safe. Johnson could go. Johnson peeled away, turned toward his base, checked his fuel. The gauge read near empty. Enough. Maybe. His hydraulic pressure was gone. Landing would be fast and dangerous. He radioed ahead, told the tower he was coming in without flaps, without brakes. The tower acknowledged. Fire crews scrambled. He crossed the coast at 2,000 feet. The airfield appeared ahead. He lined up, dropped the gear manually. The wheels locked down, he hoped. He had no indicator lights, no hydraulics to confirm. He came in fast, too fast. Touched down. The wheels held. The Mustang rolled and rolled. No brakes. Johnson cut the engine and let friction and grass slow him down. The Mustang stopped 10 feet from a fence. He sat in the cockpit for a minute, just breathing. Alive. Ground crew arrived and stared at his aircraft. 43 holes, shredded wing fabric, hydraulic fluid everywhere. A cracked windscreen. They asked how he made it back. Johnson didn't answer. He just climbed out. His legs wobbled. He leaned against the wing and closed his eyes. Someone asked how many he got. Johnson didn't know. He wasn't counting. The gun camera footage would tell the story, but Johnson didn't care about the footage. He cared about the 10 men in that bomber. They were going home. That was enough. His squadron commander found him an hour later, debriefed him, listened to the account, asked questions, took notes. At the end, the commander looked at him for a long moment, then told him he was being recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. Johnson shrugged. He did what needed doing. The commander told him something else. Intel reports said 14 Luftwaffe fighters had engaged a lone P-51 over central Germany. At least 6 confirmed destroyed, 3 more probables. The rest fled. The engagement lasted 3 minutes. Johnson flew for 3 minutes against 14 enemy fighters. And he survived. He didn't just survive, he won. The squadron commander asked how. Johnson thought about it, then gave the only answer he had. The Mustang. The aircraft they'd called a Deathtrap. The fighter pilots had mocked. It gave him speed when he needed speed, maneuverability when he needed to turn, strength when rounds tore through it. The Mustang kept flying, kept fighting. It brought him home. The commander nodded. Word spread through the group, then through other groups. The story grew, not exaggerated, not embellished. The gun camera footage confirmed everything. 1 pilot, 14 fighters, 3 minutes. Suddenly, nobody was mocking the Mustang anymore. A test happened by accident. Johnson hadn't planned to prove anything. He hadn't set out to validate the P-51's design. He'd simply seen men who needed help, and he helped them. But the footage from his gun camera changed everything. Fighter tactics in 1944 were built on assumptions drawn from previous wars. From the skies over France in 1918, from Spain in 1937, from Britain in 1940. The assumption said a lone fighter couldn't survive against overwhelming numbers. That speed alone wasn't enough. That certain maneuvers were impossible above 300 miles per hour. That structural limits constrained what pilots could attempt. Johnson's camera proved those assumptions wrong. The film showed him pulling maneuvers that should have stressed the airframe beyond its limits. Turns at speeds that should have locked up the controls. Dives that should have caused the plane to shake itself apart. Climbs that should have stalled the aircraft. He did all of it. The Mustang responded every time. The wings didn't fold. The tail didn't come off. The controls stayed effective. Engineers at North American Aviation studied the footage carefully. They watched their aircraft performing beyond design specifications, pulling 7 gigaseconds in sustained turns, diving past the red line and recovering, rolling at rates that exceeded test data. The laminar flow wing was performing better than predicted. The Merlin engine was delivering power beyond its rated limits. The structure was holding. One engineer watched the footage 3 times, then wrote a memo. It stated simply, The P-51 is capable of more than we believed. Pilots are limiting themselves based on assumptions, not reality. We need to update the flight manual. The Army Air Forces agreed. New tactical guidance went out in April 1944. P-51 pilots were cleared to operate at higher speeds, to pull harder in turns, to dive more aggressively. The aircraft could handle it. The data proved it. Johnson's footage proved it. But the tactical shift went deeper than just aircraft performance. Before Johnson's engagement, doctrine said that outnumbered fighters should disengage, run, survive, regroup. The math made sense. 3 fighters against 10 shouldn't fight. They should use their speed to escape, live to fight another day. Johnson had ignored the doctrine and won. His squadron commander started asking questions. Why did the Germans break off? They had the numbers. They had position. Johnson was alone, out of ammunition, damaged. Why did they leave? The answer was psychological. The German fighters had watched 6 of their guys go down in 3 minutes. They'd seen aggression that defied logic. A lone American who attacked instead of running, who turned into them instead of away, who fought like the numbers didn't matter. It rattled them. They started to doubt, to hesitate, and hesitation in air combat is fatal. So they disengaged, not because they were beaten tactically, but because they were beaten psychologically. A new doctrine emerged. Aggression matters. Not reckless aggression, but calculated aggression. The willingness to press an attack when logic says retreat. To turn into a threat instead of away from it. To make the enemy doubt, because doubt spreads faster than bullets. Fighter groups started teaching it, emphasizing it. P-51 pilots learned to exploit their aircraft's strength, speed, maneuverability, climb rate. They stopped flying defensively. They started dictating engagements, forcing the enemy to react, to defend, to hesitate. The results were measurable. In March 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 97 bombers. In April, after the tactical shift, losses dropped to 58. In May, 34. The curve was undeniable. Something had changed. The Luftwaffe was still dangerous, still skilled, but they were losing. The P-51 was part of it, but only part. The other part was mindset. Johnson's engagement was dissected in briefing rooms across England. Pilots studied the gun camera footage, frame by frame. They watched where he created angles, where he used speed, where he forced errors. They saw what worked and what didn't. They learned. One pilot in the 4th Fighter Group watched the footage and realized something important. Johnson never flew straight. Every few seconds, he changed heading or altitude. Small changes, 5 degrees, 10 degrees, a slight climb, a shallow dive. Never predictable, never steady. It made him nearly impossible to track. The German fighters were always correcting, always chasing, never settled. The 4th Fighter Group started teaching it. Randomize your flight path. Don't give the enemy a predictable target. Make them guess. Make them miss. Another group noticed Johnson's use of vertical maneuvers. He didn't dogfight horizontally. He used altitude, climbed, dove, used the 3rd dimension. In a flat turning fight, numbers win. In a vertical fight, energy management wins. One skilled pilot can beat many average pilots if he controls the energy. The lessons spread. By June 1944, the P-51 was no longer the mocked Deathtrap. It was the premier American fighter in Europe. Pilots were requesting assignments to Mustang units. The aircraft's reputation had completely flipped. Now it was the P-47 pilots who were grumbling. They wanted Mustangs. They wanted the range, the speed, the kills. Johnson became a training officer. He briefed new pilots, showed them the footage, walked them through the engagement step by step, explained his thought process, why he attacked, how he managed energy, where he made mistakes. Yes, mistakes. He pointed them out, the times he misjudged deflection, the moments he got slow, the angles he gave away. The new pilots listened carefully. They asked questions. How did you stay calm? How did you track 14 fighters? How did you know when to engage and when to extend? Johnson's answers were practical. You don't track 14. You track one new one you're shooting at. When that one's gone, you find the next one. You don't think about the total. You think about the immediate problem. Solve it. Move to the next. How did you stay calm? You don't. You're terrified. But you fly anyway. The fear doesn't stop you. It sharpens you, keeps you alert, keeps you alive. The briefings were recorded, transcribed, distributed. Johnson's words reached pilots in other theaters. Pacific squadrons received copies. They adapted the lessons for fighting Japanese aircraft. The principles were universal aggression, energy management, unpredictability. They worked everywhere. The Luftwaffe noticed. German pilots started reporting a shift in American tactics. More aggressive escorts. Fighters that didn't disengage. Pilots who pressed attacks despite being outnumbered. The reports filtered up the chain of command. Luftwaffe commanders adjusted their tactics. They instructed their pilots to avoid prolonged engagements with Mustangs. Strike the bombers, ignore the escorts, disengage quickly. But ignoring the escorts wasn't always possible. The P-51s stuck close to the bombers now. They didn't chase every German fighter that appeared. They maintained position, protected the heavies. When the Luftwaffe attacked, the Mustangs turned into them, forced them to fight, disrupted their attacks. The bombers survived. The missions continued. The strategic effect was profound. The bombing campaign that had nearly collapsed in late 1943 was now sustainable. Loss rates were manageable. Crews were completing their tours. Morale improved. The factories in Germany burned. The oil refineries burned. The rail yards burned. The Third Reich's war machine started to starve. One pilot's 3-minute engagement didn't win the air war, but it changed how the air war was fought. It validated an aircraft, shifted a doctrine, gave others the courage to press when logic said run. Johnson flew 73 more missions. He shot down 6 more German aircraft. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, then the Silver Star, then the Distinguished Flying Cross with clusters. He didn't talk much about any of it. Years later, someone asked him about that mission, the one with 14 Germans. Why did he do it? Johnson's answer was simple. There were 10 men in that bomber. They had families. They wanted to go home. I could help, so I did. The interviewer pressed. But it was suicide. The odds were impossible. Johnson shrugged. The odds didn't matter. The men mattered. That's the only explanation he ever gave. The impact extended far beyond tactics or doctrine. By the summer of 1944, P-51 Mustangs were rolling off production lines in massive numbers. North American Aviation's factories in California and Texas ran 3 shifts around the clock. Thousands of aircraft were being produced each month. The Army Air Forces couldn't get enough. Every fighter group in Europe was converting or had already converted. The P-47 units grumbled, but they converted too. The numbers were impossible to argue with. The kill ratios told the story. In the first quarter of 1944, P-51 units achieved a 5-to-1 kill ratio against the Luftwaffe 5 German fighters destroyed for every Mustang lost. By the second quarter, the ratio climbed to 8-to-1. The Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots faster than their training programs could replace them. Meanwhile, the Americans were gaining experience, learning, adapting. The Mustang's range enabled a completely new mission profile fighter sweeps deep into Germany. Not escorting bombers, but hunting. Groups of P-51s would roam ahead of the bomber streams, seeking out German airfields, catching fighters taking off, or landing when they were vulnerable and slow. The Mustangs would strafe runways, destroy aircraft on the ground, burn fuel depots. The Luftwaffe couldn't hide. In May 1944, A single P-51 group destroyed 67 German aircraft in one day, 23 in the air, 44 on the ground. The mission lasted 6 hours. The Mustangs flew all the way to Poland and back. No other Allied fighter had the range to even attempt it. German commanders realized they had a serious problem. The Americans could strike anywhere, anytime. The skies over the Reich were no longer safe. Luftwaffe pilots started refusing missions. Some defected, others simply stopped showing up. The will to fight was eroding. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Allies owned the sky over France. Thousands of bombers and transports crossed the English Channel in broad daylight, unmolested. The Luftwaffe made a few sorties, a handful of interceptions, but they were scattered and ineffective. P-51s were everywhere patrolling, hunting. German pilots would see them, turn back, land, and refuse to take off again. Eisenhower later stated that air superiority made the invasion possible. Without it, the landing craft would have been slaughtered on the beaches. The supply lines would have been bombed. The breakout would have failed. Air superiority wasn't guaranteed by numbers alone. It was guaranteed by reach, by the ability to strike deep, to destroy the enemy before he could threaten the landings. The P-51 provided that reach. But the aircraft's impact went beyond Europe. In the Pacific, long-range escort had been a problem since 1942. B-29 superfortresses were bombing Japan from bases in the Mariana Islands. The distance was extreme, over 1,500 miles one way. No fighter could escort them. The B-29s flew alone. Japanese fighters intercepted them. Losses mounted. In early 1945, P-51 units deployed to Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was 750 miles from Tokyo, close enough. The P-51s, with dropped tanks, could reach the Japanese mainland, escort the B-29s, and fight off interceptors. The first mission launched in April 1945. The results mirrored Europe. Japanese fighters, skilled but outnumbered, couldn't stop the combined force. The B-29s completed their missions, dropped their incendiaries, and returned home. The P-51s cleared the way. By August, the air campaign over Japan was total. American aircraft flew wherever they wanted. The Japanese Air Force was shattered. Industry was burning. Cities were burning. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the B-29s that carried them flew unescorted. They didn't need escorts. The skies were empty. The war ended. Mustang production continued into 1946, then stopped. Jets were coming. The future was turbines and swept wings. The piston-engine fighter was obsolete. But the P-51 didn't disappear. It served in Korea ground attack, close air support, escorting slower aircraft. It wasn't a match for MiG-15 jets, but it was cheap, reliable, and effective against ground targets. It saved lives. Then it served in smaller conflicts, counterinsurgency, border patrol. Some nations flew P-51s into the 1980s, 50 years after its first flight. Few aircraft achieve that kind of longevity. Beyond military service, the Mustang found a second life in air racing. Its speed and efficiency made it ideal. Racers modified them, clipped the wings, boosted the engines. They broke records, won championships. The Reno air races became a showcase for Mustangs. Thousands of people watched them scream past at 500 miles per hour, 6 inches off the ground, pylons flashing by in a blur. Warbird collectors restored them and flew them at air shows. The sound of a Merlin engine at full throttle is unforgettable, a deep, rolling thunder. Children stand with their mouths open. Veterans weep. The Mustang became a symbol, not of war, but of survival, of ingenuity, of the people who built it and flew it and brought it home. Johnson's specific aircraft, the one he flew on March 6, didn't survive. It was scrapped after the war, cut apart, melted down, recycled, no plaque, no museum. Just gone. But the footage remains. The gun camera film is digitized, archived, studied by historians, military analysts, film students. It appears in documentaries, training videos, YouTube compilations. Millions of people have watched it. Most don't know Johnson's name, but they see what he did. They see the proof. One pilot, alone, can change everything. Not through recklessness, not through luck. Through skill, courage, and a willingness to act when others wouldn't. The P-51 gave him the tools. But Johnson made the choice. That choice rippled outward through tactics, through doctrine, through the war, through history. It continues to ripple. Every fighter pilot who studies aggression and energy management stands on Johnson's shoulders. Every air combat doctrine that emphasizes initiative over caution echoes his engagement. Every pilot who turns into a threat instead of away from it is flying the lesson Johnson taught. The tools change. The aircraft evolve. Jets replace pistons. Missiles replace guns. Stealth replaces speed. But the principles remain. Aggression, energy, unpredictability, courage. They're timeless. They're universal. They're the difference between defeat and victory, between death and survival, between being forgotten and being remembered. Robert Johnson's 3 minutes over Germany are not forgotten. They live in every fighter pilot's training, in every tactical manual, in every briefing that teaches that courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is flying anyway. The P-51 Mustang is not forgotten. It lives in museums, in air shows, in the roar of a Merlin engine over a crowded ramp, in the tears of a veteran who remembers what it felt like to see that silver fighter appear when all hope was gone. They called it a death trap. They mocked it. Then one rookie proved them wrong in 3 minutes against 14 Luftwaffe aces. And the war changed. Robert Johnson returned home in the fall of 1945. The war was over. Europe was rebuilding. The Pacific was silent. Millions of men were coming back, trading uniforms for civilian clothes, putting away medals, returning to the lives they'd left behind. Johnson went back to Iowa. The farm was still there. His parents were older, grayer, relieved. They didn't ask many questions. He didn't offer many answers. There was work to be done, fences to mend, equipment to repair, that same tractor that still broke down every week. He fell back into the rhythm. Early mornings, long days, the smell of soil and diesel and growing things. It was quiet, simple, the opposite of war. He didn't talk about the missions. Not to his family, not to neighbors. When people asked, he gave short answers. Yes, he flew fighters. Yes, he saw combat. No, he didn't want to talk about it. The local newspaper printed a story. Hometown hero. Distinguished Service Cross. 7 kills. The article was respectful, accurate. Johnson read it once and never mentioned it again. He married in 1947 a schoolteacher from the next county, quiet like him. They bought a small house and raised 3 children. He worked as a mechanic, then as a flight instructor at a local airstrip, teaching crop dusters and weekend pilots. The hours were long, the pay was modest. He didn't mind. Years passed. Korea happened. Vietnam happened. Johnson watched the news and said little. When veterans groups invited him to speak, he declined. When historians requested interviews, he offered brief answers, factual, unemotional. He didn't see himself as special. He'd done his job. Others had done more. Many hadn't come home. In 1977, a researcher from the Air Force Historical Research Agency contacted him. They were compiling records from the 8th Air Force. They had his gun camera footage. They wanted to confirm details. Johnson agreed to a phone interview. The researcher asked about the engagement on March 6, 1944, walking through the timeline, the separated element, the crippled bomber, the decision to engage. Johnson corrected small details. The researcher had the altitude wrong. the number of German fighters wrong. 14, not 12. The engagement lasted closer to 4 minutes, not 3. These things mattered. The researcher asked the question everyone asked. Why did you attack? Johnson's answer hadn't changed in 33 years. The bomber needed help. The researcher pressed. But you were alone, outnumbered, low on fuel. Johnson paused, then said something he'd never said before. He was scared, more scared than he'd ever been. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold the stick. But the fear didn't matter. The men in that bomber mattered. The researcher asked if he regretted it, if he would do it differently. Johnson thought for a moment and said no. He'd do it again. Exactly the same. The interview ended. The researcher thanked him, told him the footage was being used to train modern fighter pilots, that his engagement was studied at the Air Force Academy, and his name was in the textbooks. Johnson didn't respond. He just hung up and went back to work. In 1998, the Commemorative Air Force located him. They were restoring a P-51. They wanted to dedicate it to the pilots of the 357th Fighter Group. They asked if Johnson would attend the ceremony. He declined, but his children convinced him. You should go, they said. People should know. He attended. The ceremony was small, a hangar in Texas, maybe 200 people. Veterans, families, aviation enthusiasts. The restored Mustang sat on the ramp, silver, polished, beautiful. The Merlin engine was running. The sound was exactly as Johnson remembered, deep, powerful, alive. Someone handed him a microphone and asked him to say a few words. Johnson stood there silently, looking at the aircraft. He hadn't been this close to a Mustang in 50 years. He walked over and ran his hand along the wing. The metal was cool, smooth. He closed his eyes for a moment. He was 22 again, scared again, alive again. He returned to the microphone and spoke for less than a minute. He thanked the people who restored the aircraft, thanked the people who remembered, said the Mustang was a good plane. It saved his life. It saved a lot of lives. That was all. He sat down. The audience applauded. Some were crying. Johnson didn't notice. He was looking at the Mustang, remembering. After the ceremony, younger pilots approached him. They had questions, tactical questions. How did you manage energy in a vertical fight? How did you track multiple threats? How did you stay aggressive when outnumbered? Johnson answered patiently, thoroughly. These were questions he could answer. Mechanics, physics, logic. These things made sense. One young pilot asked a different question. How did you find the courage? Johnson looked at him, really looked. The kid was maybe 25, a fighter pilot, probably flying F-16s, confident, skilled, untested. Johnson told him the truth. You don't find courage. Courage isn't something you have or don't have. Courage is what you do when you're terrified. When every instinct says run, when the math says you'll die, you act anyway. Not because you're brave, but because someone needs help and you're there. The young pilot nodded, thanked him, walked away. Johnson watched him go, wondered if the kid understood, wondered if anyone could understand until they were there alone, outnumbered, making the choice. Robert Johnson died in 2006. He was 84, surrounded by family. Quiet, peaceful. His obituary in the local paper was brief. Veteran, mechanic, father, grandfather. It mentioned the Distinguished Service Cross, but didn't explain why. The Air Force Academy heard of his passing. They flew a missing man formation over his funeral. 4 P-51s. One broke away, climbed, disappeared into the sun. His children donated his medals to a museum, his logbook, his flight suit. They're displayed in a case next to a photographed Johnson at 22 years old, standing beside a Mustang, smiling, alive. Visitors stop, read the plaque, learn the story. Some linger, some move on, but the story remains. It's taught to every fighter pilot, studied in every air combat course, cited in every manual on tactical aggression. The lesson is simple. One person can make a difference, not through recklessness, but through skill and courage and a willingness to act. The tools change, the wars change, the enemies change. But the lesson doesn't. When you see someone who needs help, you help, even if the odds are impossible, even if you're alone, even if you're scared, you act. Because that's what courage is. Not the absence of fear, but the defiance of it. Robert Johnson defied fear for 3 minutes over Germany. He saved 10 men. He changed a doctrine. He proved an aircraft. He taught a lesson. The lesson echoes through time, through wars, through generations. It echoes still. In every fighter pilot who turns into a threat instead of away from it. In every person who stands when others sit. In every choice to act when logic says freeze. The Mustang was just a machine. Aluminum and steel and a brilliant engine. It didn't win the war. People won the war. People like Robert Johnson.